pretty much any other crypto network in the top 10 to, if everything goes down, they actually have a higher probability to reach that all-time high, whereas I'm very bearish Ethereum going back to its all-time high.
You're more bullish on Ripple hitting an all-time high than Ethereum?
See? And ETH, yes.
Wow, all right.
I think Santi just really wants to be on that first clip in the beginning. So that's what's happening here.
The number Santi wrote on a whiteboard. The community is on Twitter. He's like, how can I troll each and every one?
This is the last point I made. He said decentralized product strategy in BD does not work. Decentralized security.
If you've followed Jack Claver for any amount of time, you already know this. He doesn't chase noise. He doesn't hype green candles. He studies structure. He studies liquidity. He studies who is being positioned for the future while everyone else is distracted by today. And when Jack Claver talks about XRP and HBAR heading into 2026, he's not talking about price first. He's talking about timing, mispricing, and narrative collapse. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people...
If the license is approved, it would be a, quote, new and unique benchmark for trust in the stablecoin market, as the company would be under federal and state oversight.
Jack's core thesis is simple but brutal. XRP and HBAR are not priced for what they are becoming. They are priced for what people think they are. And that gap, that misunderstanding, is where repricing happens. Right now, the market treats XRP like an old story that already played out. A lawsuit asset, a retail coin, something that had its moment and moved on. And HBAR? That one gets dismissed even faster. Too slow, too boring, too centralized. The usual lines. But Jack points out something most traders ignore. Markets don't reprice when sentiment improves. They reprice when function becomes unavoidable. And that's where 2026 comes in. According to Jack Claver's framework, 2026 is not about hype cycles or retail mania. It's about infrastructure recognition. It's the year where systems quietly built in the background finally get acknowledged by capital that cannot afford to guess. Let's start with XRP. Jack doesn't see XRP as a speculative token anymore. He frames it as a liquidity tool waiting for scale. A bridge asset designed to move value where traditional rails fail. And here's the key part. XRP doesn't need everyone to love it. It only needs institutions to need it. And need changes everything. Jack argues that the biggest mistake retail makes is assuming adoption looks loud. In reality, adoption looks boring until it suddenly isn't. It looks like pilot programs, quiet integrations, regulatory clarity nobody tweets about. Then one day liquidity turns on, and price has to adjust after the fact. Not before, after. That's why Jack believes XRP's price action before 2026 is misleading. It's not lagging. It's waiting. Waiting for volume. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for the moment when moving trillions through inefficient systems becomes politically and economically unacceptable. And when that switch flips, XRP doesn't creep upward. It gaps. Now layer HBAR into this. Jack's view on Hedera is even more controversial, because HBAR doesn't play the crypto game at all. It doesn't market to retail. It doesn't chase narratives. It doesn't beg for attention. It just builds. Jack calls HBAR the asset nobody needs, until everybody does. Why? Because Hedera is positioned at the enterprise layer, not the speculative layer. And enterprise adoption doesn't show up on YouTube thumbnails. It shows up in back-end systems, compliance frameworks, audit trails, and transaction throughput that retail never sees. Jack points out something important here. Enterprises do not care about hype. They care about predictability, cost, governance, and scale. And Hedera was designed specifically for that. So when Jack talks about 2026, he's not predicting a random pump. He's outlining a recognition phase. A phase where capital finally asks, which networks are actually being used? Not talked about. Not hyped. Used. And when that question becomes dominant, XRP and HBAR suddenly look very different. Jack also highlights timing psychology. Retail expects price to move before adoption. Institutions expect price to move after utility is proven. That mismatch is why these assets feel dead to most people right now. But according to Jack, that's exactly the trap. Because once price starts reflecting usage, It's already too late to position emotionally. The move feels unfair, sudden, violent, like the market skipped everyone. That's not manipulation. That's delayed recognition. Jack's 2026 outlook isn't about specific dollar targets. He avoids that intentionally. Instead, he focuses on relative repricing. He asks a dangerous question. What happens if XRP is no longer valued like a speculative altcoin, but like a liquidity layer? What happens if HBAR is no longer compared to meme-driven networks, but to enterprise infrastructure? You don't get small moves from that shift. You get category reclassification. And category reclassification is where generational moves come from. But here's the part Jack emphasizes the most, and it's the part most people ignore. 2026 will emotionally break impatient holders. The boredom, the doubt, the constant comparison to faster-moving assets. Jack believes most people will sell right before the reason they bought finally materializes. Not because they were wrong, but because waiting without validation is psychologically exhausting. And that's why his prediction isn't really about price. It's about who survives the waiting period. Because if Jack Claver is right, XRP and HBAR won't reward excitement. They'll reward alignment. And by the time the market agrees with him, the entry window most people wanted will already be gone. And that's where this story actually gets uncomfortable. Because if the quiet phase you're in right now feels pointless, that might be the signal you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And the real question becomes, can you stay there long enough to see it through? Here's where Jack Claver's perspective starts to feel unsettling, because he shifts the focus away from charts completely. He asks a question most people never slow down enough to ask. What if the reason XRP and HBAR feel stuck isn't because they're failing, but because they're being deliberately absorbed into systems that cannot tolerate volatility? That single idea reframes everything. Jack believes that the market is misreading silence as weakness. In reality, silence is often the final phase before something becomes too important to speculate on publicly. And when assets transition from speculation to infrastructure, the rules change quietly first, then violently later. Let's break this down the way Jack does. He points out that retail traders are trained to look for excitement, breakouts, momentum, constant movement. But institutions are trained to look for the opposite: stability, predictability, legal clarity, repeatability. And that's the collision we're watching play out with XRP and HBAR. Jack argues that XRP's real value proposition has nothing to do with moon narratives. It's about liquidity efficiency at scale. When you're moving serious money, speed isn't enough. You need reliability, regulatory compatibility, and minimal friction. That's why Jack pays more attention to who is quietly aligning with Ripple's infrastructure than what XRP does on a daily chart. He says something that sticks with you. Price is loud. Infrastructure is quiet. Until it isn't. Think about that. If XRP were truly irrelevant, institutions would have moved on years ago. They wouldn't still be testing, still building corridors, still discussing interoperability, still engaging regulators. But they are. And Jack believes that tells us something uncomfortable. The market is not pricing future necessity. It's pricing current boredom. Now look at HBAR through that same lens. Jack doesn't frame Hedera as a crypto project competing for retail attention. He frames it as a digital public utility in its infancy. And utilities don't behave like hype assets. They don't explode early. They get ignored until dependency sets in. He compares Hedera's current phase to early internet protocols. Nobody speculated on TCP, IP. Nobody hyped DNS. But once global systems depended on them, their importance became unquestionable. Jack suggests HBAR is following that exact path. And here's where it gets uncomfortable again. Retail wants price discovery. Enterprises want cost certainty. Those two desires are in direct conflict. And Jack believes price suppression, stagnation, or underperformance is not accidental. It's a natural outcome of enterprise alignment. Because you don't build global systems on assets that behave like slot machines. So when people complain that HBAR isn't moving, Jack sees that as confirmation, not failure. He also emphasizes timing. 2026, in Jack's view, is not a random year. It's the point where multiple slow-moving forces converge. Regulatory frameworks mature. Pilot programs scale. Legacy systems hit efficiency walls. And suddenly, solutions that looked unnecessary become unavoidable. Jack is very clear here. Repricing does not happen because of belief. It happens because of necessity under pressure. That's why he doesn't care about influencer sentiment. He watches capital flow pathways. He watches policy language. He watches enterprise adoption curves that move so slowly most people stop paying attention. And then he drops this line. By the time price tells the story is already over. Meaning, if you wait for confirmation, you're not early. You're just late with less risk and less reward. Jack also talks about a psychological trap that XRP and HBAR holders fall into. Comparison. You watch other assets pump. You see narratives rotate. You feel stupid for holding something that isn't exciting anymore. And slowly, doubt creeps in. Jack says this is intentional, not manipulative, but structural. Markets test conviction by withholding validation. Because if everyone could wait calmly, generational repricing wouldn't exist. The reward exists because waiting is emotionally hard. And here's where Jack's prediction sharpens. He believes XRP and HBAR will not move gradually into 2026. They will remain frustratingly slow until they aren't. And when the move comes, it won't feel fair. It will feel like the market skipped the build-up and jumped straight to the conclusion. Why? Because infrastructure adoption doesn't drip-feed price discovery. It triggers step changes. One moment, an asset is undervalued. The next, it's obviously essential. And the distance between those two realizations is much smaller than people think. Jack warns that most holders won't miss the move because they were wrong. They'll miss it because they got tired of being right too early. That's the danger zone. When you're early enough to be ignored, mocked, or bored, but not late enough to feel safe. And that's exactly where XRP and HBAR sit heading into 2026, according to Jack. Not broken, not abandoned, not forgotten by the people who matter, just waiting for a system-level reason to be repriced. And when that reason becomes visible to capital that cannot afford inefficiency anymore, price won't ask permission. It will adjust, suddenly, aggressively, and without caring who lost patience along the way. Which leads to the real question Jack wants people to ask themselves. Not how high can this go, but can I stay positioned long enough to still be holding when the market finally admits it was wrong? In his view, the biggest variable in 2026 isn't regulation, adoption, or technology. It's human behavior under prolonged uncertainty. Jack makes a sharp observation that most investors miss. Markets don't shake people out with crashes alone. They shake people out with time. Long stretches of nothing. No reward. No validation. Just enough movement to keep hope alive, but not enough to feel justified. And XRP and HBAR are masterclasses in this kind of psychological pressure. Jack argues that these assets are positioned in what he calls the conviction desert. A place where you're too early to be rewarded and too late to feel clever. And this is exactly where most people abandon positions that later define cycles. He says something blunt. The market doesn't need you to be wrong. It just needs you to get tired. That line explains more liquidations than any chart pattern ever could. Jack breaks down 3 psychological phases he believes XRP and HBAR holders will move through before repricing happens. The first phase is belief. This is when you understand the thesis. You see the utility. You know why you're holding. Everything feels logical. The second phase is doubt. This is where the charts stop agreeing with your thesis. Other assets outperform. Narratives shift. Influencers move on. And slowly, logic starts competing with emotion. The third phase is exhaustion. This is the dangerous one. You're not panicking. You're not angry. You're just tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of waiting. Tired of being early. Jack believes most people sell in phase 3. Not because they think they're wrong, but because they no longer feel motivated to be right. And according to him, XRP and HBAR are dragging holders directly into that phase right now. He also explains why this happens structurally. Assets tied to infrastructure mature differently than speculative assets. They don't spike on belief. They move when usage forces repricing. And usage grows quietly, invisibly, without price responding in a way that feels fair. That disconnect creates emotional whiplash. You see positive news, adoption headlines, enterprise partnerships, regulatory clarity, and yet, price does nothing. Jack calls this cognitive dissonance investing. When everything makes sense except the only thing people care about. And here's the uncomfortable truth he points out. Price is the last thing to update, not the first. Markets validate outcomes, not progress. So while XRP is being positioned as a liquidity bridge and HBAR is embedding itself into enterprise-grade systems, the market withholds recognition because recognition is only required once the dependency becomes undeniable. Jack says people assume the market is forward-looking. In reality, it's confirmation-seeking. It waits until the risk of being wrong is lower, even if the upside is smaller. And that creates opportunity for those willing to tolerate being early without applause. Jack also addresses a major fear many holders won't admit out loud. What if it never happens? He doesn't dismiss that fear. He respects it, but he reframes it. He says the real risk is not that XRP or HBAR fail technologically. The real risk is that you emotionally exit before the thesis has time to mature. Because infrastructure timelines don't align with human impatience. Banks don't move fast. Governments don't pivot quickly. Enterprises don't adopt recklessly. Everything that makes XRP and HBAR valuable also makes them slow. And slow is painful when you're watching faster narratives outperform. Jack emphasizes that 2026 is not about a clean breakout line on a chart. It's about recognition lag finally collapsing. For years, price has lagged behind progress. That gap creates pressure. Pressure builds quietly until the market has no choice but to resolve it. And resolution never happens gently. It happens when a narrative breaks. When the question shifts from, why would anyone need this? To, how did we not price this earlier? Jack believes that moment is closer than most people think, but farther than most people can emotionally endure. That's the paradox. He also talks about identity. Many holders subconsciously tie their self-worth to being early. When early turns into too early, frustration sets in, doubt follows, and eventually detachment. Jack warns against this. He says conviction should not be loud. Should be boring, quiet, grounded, almost dull. Because if holding XRP or HBAR feels exciting right now, you're probably not aligned with how infrastructure assets actually behave. Excitement comes at the end, not the beginning. And that leads to his final psychological insight. When repricing finally begins, it will feel wrong. Too fast, too sudden, too late to act calmly. Jack says most people imagine they'll sell rationally into strength. In reality, most will freeze, shocked that something they waited years for is suddenly moving without them emotionally prepared. That's why the work happens now. Not on charts, not on predictions, but on patience. Jack's prediction for 2026 isn't a price target. It's a warning. If you can't tolerate being ignored, you won't be around when recognition arrives. If you need constant validation, infrastructure assets will break you before they reward you. And if you confuse boredom with failure, you'll likely exit right before the reason you believed finally becomes obvious to everyone else. So the real takeaway from Jack Claver's outlook isn't about XRP or HBAR at all. It's about whether you can sit in uncertainty without rewriting your own conviction. Because when the market finally moves, it won't wait for you to feel ready. It never does. This is the moment where everything tightens. Not the charts, not the headlines, your mindset. Because if Jack Claver's outlook for 2026 is even partially correct, then XRP and HBAR are not testing technology, regulation, or adoption anymore. They're testing people, testing patience, testing discipline, testing whether you can sit in something quiet while the world chases noise. The truth is uncomfortable. If XRP and HBAR were already exciting, you'd probably be too late. Infrastructure doesn't invite you in with fireworks. It lets you get bored. It lets you doubt yourself. It lets you feel isolated. And then, when dependency becomes undeniable, it revalues itself without apology. Jack's prediction isn't that 2026 will be loud from the start. It's that it will be remembered as the year the market finally admitted it mispriced necessity. And when that happens, price doesn't negotiate. It reclassifies. Assets once treated like speculative experiments suddenly get valued like system-level tools. Liquidity bridges stop being compared to meme coins. Enterprise networks stop being judged by hype metrics. And the market shifts from disbelief to urgency almost overnight. That's the kind of move that doesn't give second chances. So here's the real question you need to sit with. Can you stay positioned when there's nothing exciting to post about? Can you hold conviction without applause? Can you separate boredom from failure? Because the people who win cycles like this aren't the loudest. They're the ones who didn't flinch when nothing happened. If this breakdown helped you see the cycle more clearly, like this video so it reaches others who might be doubting themselves right now. Subscribe if you want analysis focused on structure, psychology, and long-term positioning, not hype and panic. And most importantly, comment below with one word that describes where you are right now. Patient, uncertain, committed, or ready. Because clarity is positioning. And positioning is everything when the market finally decides it can't ignore reality anymore.